and being with us this morning. So before I call the meeting to order, Madam Attorney, may I ask you, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you do have quorum.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I have a responsibility here to read the information as it would relate to conflict of interest, and I'll do so. General Statute 138A 15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to the matter before the Environmental Management Commission, Groundwater and Waste Management Committee. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict, please say so at this time. Of any of the members here, is there any conflict of interest that we need to be made aware of? Okay. Having heard none, I think we'll go forward. I think one of the action items that we have is to approve the minutes. So can I get a motion to approve the minutes from the meeting? Someone make a motion and a second. Motion made. Can I get a second to approve the minutes?
Commissioner Keen, second.
Second. Any discussion? Okay, I think we had a motion and a second, so the minutes are approved. And fantastic. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I get a vote? All those saying aye, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. Like sign. Okay, we got a vote. Thank you. There is an issue that I would like to discuss this morning before we get into the body of the meeting that we have. Many of you may know that Chairman Solomon received a letter from the Secretary as it would relate to my role on this commission, as well as the Vice Chair Baumgartner's role on this committee. I think it's only responsible that we have an opportunity to discuss our side of it and give anybody around the table that's on this committee an opportunity to weigh in as well. But before we do, I do have some prepared remarks. I'll give mine at the end. But I'd like to start with giving our Vice Chair, Tim Baumgartner, an opportunity to really lay out exactly what took place, and it had to do with bringing an action item before this committee on PFAS, and that was outlined in the letter. So, Commissioner Baumgartner, if you will, would you share some thoughts you have on that, and I will as well.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I want to say that we, the chair and vice chair of this committee, are extremely disappointed in the way DEQ handled and its leadership handled the communication and the situation with Secretary posting a letter in response to the decisions that were made, never communicating with this committee. Instead, they chose to grandstand when they didn't get its way, not come to this committee and talk and discuss fully the issues that were coming before this committee. These are the facts. DWM scheduled a meeting with the chair and vice chair of this committee to review the draft agenda on 3 p.m. Friday, April 19th. In that meeting were Director Scott, Jessica Monty, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Reardon, and myself. As we reviewed the draft agenda, it was noted that by DWM that 15A NCAC 2L020 fiscal analysis would not be ready for review by this committee by this meeting today, May 8th. Chair Reardon and I agreed that without a fiscal analysis to review, not a review of analysis, but the fiscal analysis itself to review, the discussion of the 2L PFAS rule could remain as an information item. We did not direct an information item. We said it could remain as one. No one from DEQ, its staff, or its leadership engaged either the chair Reardon or myself to see if there could be some path forward for the 2L PFAS rules and for it to remain as an action item. The chair and vice chair of this committee were not engaged after April 19th at all, as I said, by its leadership for any further conversation about this issue. Instead, DEQ chose to grandstand, issuing public statements rather than working through the issues with the EMC and this committee. The lack of respect by DEQ for this commission's members is evidence of lack of communication and its disregard for providing documents to the EMC for review in a timely manner. This committee and commission deserve the right to review a full package before any consideration to move forward of these rules goes through the process. North Carolina Administrative Procedures Act, General Statute 150B requires the development of an approval of a fiscal note for rulemaking. So why has DEQ not at least shared a draft of the fiscal analysis with this group? Secretary Bowser issued a letter on May 1, 2024, and subsequent press release leveraging accusations of this committee's chair and vice chair. The Secretary stated that staff had presented at least 3 meetings on these proposed standards. Presentation does not mean completeness. In the November 2023 meeting minutes, the full commission, the minutes state, and I quote, Ms. Monty is helping coordinate a regulatory impact analysis for the 2L groundwater standards. If in fact DWM was working on that fiscal note 6 months ago, where is at least a draft before this committee to review? In each subsequent meeting that Bowser refers to, there was no draft and no fiscal note provided to this committee. During all DEQ's grandstanding, DEQ did not provide this committee nor the EMC with a complete set of documents 2 weeks prior to the meeting, which is current EMC policy. In fact, documents for this committee were not posted in full until last Friday. In fact, even yesterday, DWM made modifications to the agenda and a couple of the presentations. The fiscal analysis for 2L PFAS rule has not been posted to the EMC for review as of today. It was the chair and vice chair's understanding on April 19th from DWM that a fiscal note would not be ready for this meeting, and they have never offered a draft for consideration to move this rule proposal forward. If the department was so inclined for the 2L PFAS rule to be heard as an action item in this meeting, why didn't they reach out to discuss with the leadership of this committee first? Let's be clear, this committee nor the EMC will be developing any standards based on cost. However, a fiscal analysis needed in full to ensure as these rules go through public hearing in a manner that public can understand and fully understand the implications of the rule. It's also a requirement by state statute. This rule application and associated cost implications for implementation need to be included. This persistent disregard for this committee stops today. All documents and any requests for this before this committee will be provided for this committee no later than 2 weeks prior to the scheduled meeting date, or that will be removed. That item will be removed from the agenda. Additionally, if there is further debate concerning items to be placed on this agenda, DEQ leadership will engage the chair and vice chair of this committee prior to the 2-week deadline. This public we serve deserves a solid rulemaking process that complies fully with APA, that is completely reviewed and conforms with the statutes and rules. This commission cannot do that if DEQ intends to work against us withholding documents and grandstanding instead of engaging. Mr. Chairman, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Baumgartner. I do have some comments myself. I would like to say right up front, I am disappointed that the Secretary decided to make this a public issue without having any additional conversations with us, the chair or the vice chair, as it would relate to making this an action item. I do find this most disturbing and not in keeping with the character of what I've expected in those in a leadership position. I can assure you to the committee that the decision to remove PFAS from the agenda was to allow this committee sitting here today to have access to all the materials at one time. In fact, I recently learned that we received letters from the committee asking more time to be provided and more complete discussions to take place before the committee and the EMC before the vote. I was completely unaware of those letters. I've never read those letters, nor had any conversation with anyone associated with these letters. The decision to remove this from the agenda was solely based that all the materials required for rules to be adopted, including the fiscal note, was not provided to us in a timely manner and was not to be provided and afforded to the members of this committee. I believe the committee should send complete packets to the full EMC. I think our chairman, J.D. Solomon, would want the materials coming out of a committee when going to the larger EMC to have all the pieces with it and done at one time, not in a piecemeal manner. I, like Our Vice Chair Baumgartner have asked that all materials be sent to the members of this committee 2 weeks in advance. I've asked for hard copies. I'm a little older, so I like reading paper, but that's okay. And I hope that that can be accommodated going forward. I think we can do better than this for the citizens of North Carolina. I think we have a huge responsibility here. What's entrusted upon us in looking and passing rules that ensure the safety and well-being of every citizen in this state deserves, if you serve on this committee and in this capacity, that you have all the materials you need to make a good decision for the benefit of the citizens of this state. I've served as over the food safety program for this state for 43 years. I took my responsibility for the citizens to have safe food every day with the utmost importance, with integrity and character. That didn't stop when I became a member of this commission. In fact, it's the background for where I see things. It's the safety of every citizen in this state. But I do believe that this commission is charged and this committee with having all the information necessary to make good decisions. I'll ask if there's anyone on the committee that would like to make comments. You'll surely be recognized to do so. Any comments from the other committee members? Yes. Commissioner Yarborough.
I too was totally disappointed that any secretary would present a paper like that. And the main reason for it, I've known Joe Reardon for close to 40 years. And just as he said, he supported anything. I've never seen him back down from anybody when it came to public safety. He should have been fired several times for what he did to protect public safety. And to have any kind of resentment toward that, whether the facts were, like Mr. Baumgartner said, is irrelevant to me. To come along and a fellow that's served this state for as long as he has, and the reputation that he has, to come up with that kind of is just unfathomable to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Yarborough. Any other comments from the commissioners? You're welcome to speak and be recognized. Okay. Well, we'll carry us back to the agenda now. And so I think there is an action item. Director Michael Scott, if you'll help us here.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do have an action item before the committee today, followed by 3 informational items. So the first action item revolves our dry cleaning program as part of the rule review process. And I believe Jessica Monte is presenting, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome, Jessica.
Good morning, Chair Reardon, members of the committee. I'll be presenting the periodic review of existing rules for 15A NCAC 02S, which governs the Dry Cleaning Solvent Cleanup Act. So the first few slides go over the procedure for the periodic review of existing rules. We've shown these before for 02B and the UST rules that were previously before this committee. So I won't go through these slides too in depth, but there's the 3 steps for the agency, the Rule Review Commission, and the legislative review. Agencies can do unnecessary or unnecessary designations for the rules and accept public comments, finalize the report, and submit to RRC. And then the RRC will prepare the final report, approve it, and submit it to the legislature. And the final determination doesn't become effective until after it's gone to the legislature. So the rules that you have before you today as an attachment for review are the rules and criteria for administration of the Dry Cleaning Solvent Cleanup Fund. This is a review of other rules under UST that are going to be or have come before this committee. So 02T you've seen before, and that's out for public notice right now, just giving an update overall of the DWM rules for rule review. The dry cleaning rules were promulgated under Chapter 143, Article 21A in general statutes. Also provided the link to that program on our website and give an overview of what the purpose of the existing rules are. So they set up criteria for determining eligibility for certification into the fund, minimum management practices, lay out a risk-based approach that's also allowed per statute, and then the criteria for the disbursement of funds. For this rule review, you'll see in the rule review report that 14 of the rules in subchapter O2S were categorized as necessary, so they will go through the readoption process. 2 of the rules were categorized as unnecessary, and which means that once this process is over of putting this rule review report out for public comment, as long as everything is approved, those 2 rules will be removed from the code. Those rules are 0302, other potentially responsible parties, and 0507, remedial action plan. The reason why the department is recommending a categorization of unnecessary is because the first part of the rule is just giving permission for the division to notify other potentially responsible parties that a petition was filed. It's a public record that that's happened, so a rule is not really necessary for DISCA program to be able to notify another PRP. And the second part of that rule is about requesting information about a site from other PRPs. It's not necessary for the DISCA program to request this information. They can request it without the rule. And the petitioner is already required by the statute to provide all information necessary to demonstrate that the site is eligible for the program. The other rule that's categorized as unnecessary, 0507, when this rule was originally written, the DISCA program, when the DISCA program was first, it was the first to implement risk-based rules under the statute. So as that rule is written, an RAP was to be prepared for any site that exceeded risk-based levels. But as these risk-based rules in the statute were implemented, it became apparent that preparing the requirement to prepare an RAP is not necessary. Any site that exceeds a risk-based level will be closed out under the land use restrictions and risk management plan for the risk-based remediation. It's also unnecessary because remedial action under this program is conducted for the purpose of either eliminating a potential exposure pathway at a site under Rule 0502 or reducing contaminant levels at the site under Rule 0505. So those other 2 rules would cover those circumstances, and neither of those circumstances would require an RAP to be prepared. DEQ holds regular stakeholder meeting groups on a regular basis. They meet twice a year. So we solicited at the recent meeting or meetings, solicited feedback from those stakeholders, and the stakeholders that attend those meetings regularly are listed there with the DWM and the program staff. And also the Association of Launderers and Cleaners is included in those who we solicited feedback from. This is just showing an example of what the attachment shows. These are all the rules that are in O2S and when they were last looked at or reviewed, or when they were last amended or changed, and then whether they are necessary or unnecessary, and if they are required to implement a federal regulation. So this is a proposed timeline for this rule review coming to this committee in May, going before the full EMC in July, file it with OAH to be published on the websites for the public comment period from July to September, and back before the full EMC in November, and then going to the RRC after that for approval. And then it would go to the legislature. So our request is an approval to proceed to the EMC with the rule review report, initial determinations for 15A and CAC O2S. Any questions?
Thank you, Jessica. Is there any questions for her regarding the presentation and moving these rules forward?
Question,
Yes,
Mr. King.
yes.
Can you tell me what year this last report was amended, or kept referring to when it was done? So is there a year I can see?
The last time we did this piece review, the rule was in 2015.
It was 20 what?
2015.
If you like follow up, please.
Yes.
Since it was redone in 2015, when was 1.4 Dioxin and Gen X started through the department for investigation? Was that 2016 or 17?
I think it was,
18?
I'll let Michael, do you want to answer? I'm not sure.
Yes.
It's a question for
Michael
record.
Scott, Director of Waste Management, may need some support on 1,4 saying Gen X would have been 2016, 2017 is the answer for Gen X. When the work started in the Cape Fear Basin, the start date for 1,4 saying I may need somebody to help with that answer. I don't know if Richard's group's here.
And the rules, even though the rule review report was done in 2015, they were last readopted effective September 2018. So it would have been between 2015, 2018 that these rules were worked on and finalized as readopted in 2018.
Answer one for question. Good morning. My name is Franny Nelson. I'm the Department Environmental Toxicologist. I can answer the 1,4-dioxane question.
Okay.
1,4-dioxane monitoring started across the U.S. with the EPA's unregulated contaminant monitoring rule number 3 in 2013 to 2015. And so that was the first data that we had from North Carolina. And then after that program published their data, we started environmental monitoring across the state based on those results. 2013 was the very first time we had 1,4-dioxane data.
Okay, is that speaking from the federal level?
Yes, the
Okay.
first 2 years were federal data.
Okay, how about the state?
They started in, I believe, 2016 after the UCMR3 data was published and the high levels of 1,4-dioxane were identified in the state.
Okay, thank you. Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner?
Moving forward then with this, are you exploring 1.4-dioxane in these solvents?
Michael?
Question, that was
Yes. Mike?
Yeah,
question
Mr.
for the
Chairman,
record.
we have our program manager here. If it's okay, if she would speak to the details.
Absolutely, please do.
If you don't mind introducing yourself, Delon.
Delonda Alexander, I'm the branch manager over the dry cleaning program. We are not looking at 1,4-dioxane. We have not sampled for that to date. That has not shown up as a constituent of concern at dry cleaners.
Follow up?
Yes, Commissioner?
Question for the record, then, if the waste, it is a cleanup rule, and when you clean up and dispose of it, it becomes waste, and is that waste toxic in a way that 1.4-dioxane should be looked into to see if this waste component and chemical is part of the waste?
All waste generated at dry cleaning sites under our program are disposed of as hazardous waste. We don't sample it for characteristics. We automatically assume it's hazardous waste, so any chemical constituents considered hazardous in soil or groundwater is being sent to an appropriate treatment facility.
Follow up, please, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner King?
And for the record, has the department in the past identified 1.4 as a toxin or a hazardous waste? I think that question was before the assistant secretary about 4 months ago, and I just wanted to clarify that.
That might be Fran, I don't know. Was that for the dry cleaning program or for the DEQ in
No,
general?
it was just 1.4 in the study that was being done, and that was a report from the secretary's office.
So 1,4-dioxane is a solvent and it's used in the chemical manufacturing process. Normally when they dispose of it, I believe it is disposed of as a hazardous waste or with chlorinated waste because it's usually mixed with other things. There's no cleanup rules for it for right now, from what I understand. And the carcinogenic properties of that compound, I think, would denote it as hazardous waste, but I don't know what it is classified federally currently. And Michael, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, thank you, Franny. We've got some of the rest of our hazardous waste team here. Maybe follow up on the question Commissioner King regarding, is it classified as a hazardous waste? Or I may not be understanding the endpoint of your 1,4-dioxane question.
I asked in the minutes about 3 or 4 months ago, was this being classified? It might have been even before that. Is it being classified as a toxic waste? PFAS, 1.4, I know there are 2 individual chemicals, but the 1.4, if it is in fact in this waste product and it is a cleanup, where is it going to be placed? And is it going to be placed above ground or below ground in a waste disposal area? And I just want that to be on the record so we can get an answer If we can't get it through the presentation today, have it at the next presentation.
And so on I think there's two pieces you were touching on. So
Okay.
PFAS is not hazardous. So we'll start with that. And then we allow it to go for Subtitle D disposal, which is where your household garbage goes, right? Lined landfills with extensive environmental monitoring. There are sites that are being cleaned up where they will also send PFAS waste to Subtitle C, or hazardous waste disposal. That's what Delonda was alluding to in answering your question from the dry cleaning perspective. Soil, other media that's removed from contaminated dry cleaning sites is treated basically as hazardous and goes to appropriate type of facility. Your question is specific to PFAS, which I just touched on. I hope that helps.
I
And
touched
then
on
for-
with PFAS.
Yeah.
Let's get a 1.4 dioxin down.
Then 1,4-dioxane. I don't know that 1,4-dioxane is going off for hazardous waste disposal. We may need to follow up on that and support with some other feedback from colleagues.
I have the answer. 1,4-dioxane is on the hazardous waste list, and that's because it's regulated by OSHA and NIOSH and the National Toxicology Program.
The national piece.
Yes,
The FDA does not have a standard on 1.4.
I don't believe so because
No,
it's
they
not
don't.
a food or
So-
drug.
So my question is for North Carolina, for the health of this waste being a solvent, and now with 1.4, is it a part of the solvent? And it's going to be part of the cleanup rule. And do we know about 1.4 for these solvents?
It's not generally a constituent of dry cleaning waste because that's usually TC and other stain removers and degreasers. I don't know if the programs are sampling for that at those sites. Delonda said that they were not.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll stop at this time, but I do want it on record that I do have a concern about the solvents. I'm familiar with dry cleaning laundries. And we're going to take on water quality, as you know, I'm chair, and the committee, we're going to take a deep dive in 1.4. And this is coming up now with the solvent cleanup rule and moving forward. And if it crosses paths, I'd like 1.4 to be studied in the process of this particular rule, so we can get a good answer or good overview of the solvents and where they're going to be placed in North Carolina.
Thank you, Commissioner
Thank you,
King.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Director Scott, I'm sorry.
If it's okay, I had a couple questions. Is that,
Wait,
I'm
let's do
sorry.
her question. Michael,
Yeah, it's up to you. We have some additional hazardous waste staff that we're going to help follow up, so we'll yield to you, Chairman, obviously, and Commissioner Bailey.
Commissioner Bailey?
Thank you very much. This is Commissioner Bailey. And I just wanted to get back to the necessary and unnecessary part of this. I thought it would be less burdensome for the regulated community to not have to do remedial action plans, because as being a part of being in a company and having to deal with these things, it seems like that lessens the cost of the rule if they're not required. That was one comment I had, and I had a second comment too. So am I looking at that correctly? It was unnecessary, and if it had been imposed, it costs more time and money usually with hiring a consultant.
I'll let Delonda speak to that. I think that it was that we can get what we need out of that from other rules, not necessarily that they
Okay.
just are doing less, but I'll let
Right,
Delonda
let me
answer.
know.
Yeah, cost was not a factor in that at all, but you're correct. And of course, that does save money and to not do something that we feel is unnecessary to do. In the risk-based program, everything we do is put into a risk management plan. So that kind of covers the same thing. So it's redundant to do a remedial action plan.
Right, and it was one extra document that
Correct.
the responsible parties don't have to do.
Correct.
And so for the other unnecessary rule, it seemed to me that, again, that was more redundant. It was, and that's what our goal is with doing these rules reviews, is to make sure that the rules are streamlined So it's not taking any rights away for getting information or notices.
Correct.
I guess is what I was hearing.
Yeah, we can request that information and it is provided to us by a voluntary party that wants to come in our program. So it's to their best interest to give us that information. We don't need a rule to ask for that information.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
And can I just go back and address, I just want to make sure that these rules that we're asking to be readopted, there's no chemicals specified there that we look for. So it's not chemical specific. We look for a suite of chemicals related to dry cleaners, and then we dispose of everything as hazardous waste. Even if it's below a level that would be considered non-hazardous, we are very conservative and take the approach that we're treating it all as hazardous. So if 1,4-dioxane is in with TCE and PCE and everything else, it's getting disposed of as hazardous waste and being treated the most conservatively.
Thank you very much. Let's come back. Director Scott, I know that we were responding to Commissioner King and some requests that he had. Did you have additional comments on that? I don't want to digress, but I think it's important to make sure there's a process to get you the answers to the questions that you had. And
Yeah, I think thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're trying to clarify PFAS. I think we had one additional colleague, Adam Ulishny, who's going to help us with the 1,4-dioxane piece so that we get it answered the best we can, and any follow-up we'll definitely come back to.
Sure, to your question, it's a good question.
if you identify yourself.
My name is Adam Ulishny. I'm Deputy Director of Division of Waste Management.
Thank you.
For 1,4-dioxane, we do have standards for 1,4-dioxane, 2L groundwater standards and soil groundwater standards. As part of our hazardous waste facilities, it's a U-listed waste, so all of our hazardous waste permitted facilities are required by Appendix 9 to sample for 1,4-dioxane in their groundwater monitoring networks.
Commissioner King, in response to what he shared, is there any additional questions or anything that we need follow up on, Director Scott? Or
I'm familiar with the rules, Mr. Chairman, and the surface and groundwater P standards, but my concern is moving forward as a point source, and we are identifying point sources with 1.4, whether they're in-stream, upstream, downstream, waste management, municipalities, anywhere that waste is stored. 1.4 is going to become like PFAS. It's going to become a forever chemical. It just don't go away. And we're going to just recognize, I would hope in our committee on water quality, is to identify all the point sources. And if there's a way to pull out 1.4 of these solvents, if it is in fact in there, and you said earlier that you don't check for that, then maybe it's something that we need to look forward and lean into to see if it is. Thank you.
thank you, Commissioner King. Thank you, Director Scott. Thank you for our presenters. Any additional questions back to the dry cleaning solvent on these rules being identified as necessary and needing to go forward? Any additional questions? If not, we're going to take a motion. Any questions? Any other comments? Okay, haven't heard none. I'll look for a motion. Oh, we do? Yes, Yvonne, excuse me, Commissioner Deerheck, or?
Well, I worked in the hazardous waste listing program for a long time.
Right.
And I wanted to just provide Commissioner Keenan, I'm sure the staff can do a better job than I. But when a dry cleaning solvent was listed, is it an F or a K waste? I can't remember. In part 2.6.
F002.
F is listed as F002. And then, as the other gentleman said, the individual chemical dioxane is U108. Those are in federal standards. But the F002, when EPA develops and promulgated that listing of different categories of industrial waste, they do a thorough analysis of the composition of the solvents. So the waste analysis was done at that time before they decided to list it. And that's when they determined that there was no dioxane, I suppose, in it. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Deerhake. Just going back to the dates, and are we outdating, or are we finding in 2024 much more, a lot more areas that we're testing? And just to be sure that we are covered, if we look at the 214, 215 regulations or testing methods, the methodology and the technology that we have today may outdate some of those pieces back in 2014, 15. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I started questioning with the dates to get in line and when all of this what is started and amended and where we are today, particularly moving forward with 1.4. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner King. Yes,
I'm ready to make the motion.
you ready to
if
make
you
a
so
motion? We're
desire.
ready for a motion. We got a
Okay,
lot to
this is
do.
Commissioner Bailey, and I move to approve to send the rules to the EMC with the 2024 periodic, review of 15A NCAC 02S rules and criteria for the administration of the dry cleaning solvent cleanup fund.
Thank you, Commissioner Bailey. Do we have a second?
A second.
Thank you, Commissioner King, for your second. Any discussion?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I would certainly would like follow-up and on the record of these questions. And as, if we could, Mr. Chairman, I feel like it's important moving forward on the 1.4. Just getting this out in the open in this committee. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you for your discussion on that topic. Any additional discussions for any other commissioners that's on this committee? Haven't heard none, I'll take a vote. All those in favor of moving this forward, please vote with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, like sign. Having heard none, it's unanimous. We'll move these forward. Commissioner King, and we will include in the record the questions that you had, the importance that you provided on that. So having resolved that, if there's no other issues there, Michael, I'm going to call on you. I think you have several information items. That was the only action item that I had on the agenda that I've recently received. Will you all help us here with the presentations that we're to have?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do have 3 additional informational items. The first one is a coal ash management rulemaking update from our new section chief, Jason Watkins of the Solid Waste Program, and then it'll be followed by 2 PFAS informational items, Mr. Chairman.
And the only thing I would say as chair is I know we are going from 10:15 to 11:45, so we're going to be responsible at our time and our questions and try our best to stay in the bracket of time they give us. And so having said that, I know you'll be brief but informative. So please, Jason, if you'll go forward.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Reardon, committee members. I am Jason Watkins, the new solid waste section chief in the Division of Waste Management. I will try to cooperate certainly and get you out of this topic at least very quickly, as long as you're willing to cooperate with me. So just to give you a quick update on where we are with coal ash management, coal ash rules.
Thank you.
And so I know there's a lot of interest specifically to the session law from last session, 2013-138, specific to the adopting permanent rules for closure and post-closure of the coal combustion residual surface impoundments and landfills. Again, just to point out here, again, it says we may adopt rules, but the more important part of that session law last year ultimately is that, there will be no requirement for a fiscal note or rules review commission review. So that will certainly, once we get into rules development, should streamline the process substantially. Let's talk a little bit about rule development and what we're doing and some of the things that we're debating or talking about as we look at, our rules needed ultimately. And so, we currently have a very robust statute here in North Carolina managing coal ash, the Coal Ash Management Act in 2014. And we have a 2020 consent order, with Duke Energy for cleanup of coal ash here in the state. So certainly we've got to determine if there are rule gaps in implementing either of those 2 things. We certainly have to consider whether or not there are facilities out there that are not applicable under either of those 2 things. And if they are, there may need rules to capture that. And then ultimately, the best use of state resources is ultimately, where we may need rules is if we go forth with the path towards state permit approval from EPA. And so when we look at that being the measurement for where the most rules may come into play, that's where I'm going to spend a little bit of my time today, just letting you know what that process is. And so ultimately, if state program approval would encompass both the CCR landfills and impoundments, it would operate in lieu of the federal rules, meaning there would only be state level oversight. The absence of a state program generally means EPA must implement a program, and I'm pretty certain EPA doesn't want to implement a program, so that kind of gives you an idea there. And then ultimately, we know for certain if we go towards state program approval, there will be rule development required. So talk a little bit about where we are currently to my first question and considering what have we been doing. As a reminder, we've been
actively cleaning up coal ash, here in the state of North Carolina for a little bit over a decade now. And so with that, looking at the bigger picture, we are excavating over 100 million tons of CCR here in North Carolina under 2 general thought processes. Again, pointing back to the statute and to that consent agreement. Part of that is we're going to dispose of CCR in permitted landfills, and then we're also going to process CCR out of the impoundments for beneficial reuse into coal combustion products. And just a note, 1 ton ultimately equals about 1 cubic yard of coal ash. So again, we're a little bit over 100 million cubic yards total. What that breakdown ultimately is, just to give you an idea on the excavation of the impoundments. When we look at disposal, there's 10 sites. The ones you see in blue there are ultimately completed at this point in time, and that's the picture you see there. That is the asphalt, the closed asphalt facility. It is now what you see in the background there is the old impoundment adjacent to I-26. That is the new closed landfill with a MSE wall that has been put in place there. That's certainly a nice picture, and I'll give credit to our staff who like to deal with drones all the time. And then, like I say, we are processing 4 different sites, the Buck, Cape Fear, HF Lee, and Witherspoon facilities through STAR process to reburn ash. So that's where we are permanently before, but like I say, looking at the best use of state resources and where we may have to write rules, certainly we would want to go at, capturing everything at once. So a little bit about what the state permit program approval is. The total process takes about 2 to 3 years. Ultimately, if rule development is needed, and we think it would be, that would take place prior to a formal application actually going to EPA. And so what we are currently doing and what we will continue to do is cooperate with EPA to talk about making sure our package, when we do submit it, is approvable first time, and instead of going back and forth like some of the other states that have tried that. Certainly, this is an endeavor that goes beyond the scope of current department and division resources. And so in 2023, we sought after and received, at least in my 25-year career here, the first time we've ever got funding in the solid waste program through an EPA CCR grant to allow us to hire some outside help to work on this project. And just earlier this spring, we have hired our first 2 staff who are working on that critical piece of trying to look at gaps between state and federal provisions and making sure our current process is at least protective as the federal. The grant does allow us to hire additional staff. And so as we move in this process, we'll look to do that as resource needs are there. We met with that in mind. We met with EPA last month, Region 4 staff, to discuss our implementation plan for the grant and for our path forward on trying to make the determination on applicability. And just to give you guys a little bit of scope as to the realm or what this undertaking is, there's over 700 law references just on the landfill side alone, and in excess potentially of 1,200 on the impoundment side. And just as a reminder, the federal CCR rules embedded in them are provisions related to everything from water quality to dam safety to air quality. And so we're having to look across multiple DEQ programs and law references in that regard. So again, what we're having to review in that process ultimately is that legal consent agreement from 2020 between Duke, the department, and several environmental groups. And really that was to the 6 large sites, Allen, Blues Creek, Cliffside Rogers, Marshall, Mayo, and Roxborough. We're currently looking at the general statutes, not just the Coal Ash Management Act, but any other statutes that may be applicable, the administrative code as it exists right now. Implementation, and really what implementation is a reminder for the committee here. We were building coal ash landfills well before the Dan River spill and before the Coal Ash Management Act, and so we've got a little bit of history here. So both on the implementation and the precedent side, we have things that we've done business through the years that we have to look at and make sure whether rules are needed to cover some of those areas. So what does that path forward look like? So we already have a regular annually scheduled meeting with EPA Region 4 under the Solid Waste and Materials Management program in June down in Georgia. And so we'll be utilizing our trip down there to also talk with EPA staff a little more on the coal ash side of things. Our plan right now is to work diligently through the rest of this year with EPA, trying to figure out where rule necessity is potentially needed. And if we go to rule development, ultimately it will be started next year. And the reason for that is ultimately, if we are going for state program approval, ultimately we would need to be submitting a formal application sometime in mid to late 2026. And so just a quick reminder, without the fiscal note process, without rules review, this is just draft. It's ultimately scheduled to change depending on when we're able to get our work done on the front end. But at the very earliest at this point in time, we would be coming back in front of the committee here in January, hopes to be in front of the EMC and to public comment by late in the spring, and then ultimately back for readoption in front of the full commission in September would be the earliest, and then to OAH submittal. So that just gives you a quick update on where we are, our thought process, and some of the challenges we currently face in looking at rules adoption. So with that, as I said, I'll be brief and welcome any questions.
Very informative, Jason. Thank you. Any questions from the commissioner at the table here on this committee?
I got one, Chairman.
Yes, Vice Chairman Baumgartner.
Yes, Commissioner Baumgartner, are there any existing coal fire plants now, and are they remediating according to today's standards? If you said that, I'm sorry I missed that.
So right now, they're the only facility, so we have in the consent agreement and in the current Coal Ash Management Act coverage of all the currently operating coal plants in the state. And so all of those are currently covered, in current process. But, as many of you may or may not know, the federal law has changed multiple times over since 2015 when it was initially instigated. So when that started and their rules have changed multiple times, it's made us go back and have to change our thought process and potentially capture other things. And so that's one of the things we're looking at. There was a new variation of the federal CCR rule just came out about 10 days ago related to legacy coal ash management units. And so, again, we're having to stop, pause in the middle of the process. We'd already started to look at the new changes to the federal rule and determine if we're now missing something else.
So, I mean, there's, maybe rephrase the question. Is there any plants now producing coal ash, or have all those gone closed?
No, Duke still has current operational facilities.
Okay.
Right now.
Okay, just curious.
Yeah. Is there a number on that, Jason? How many plants, do you know how many still operational in would?
I mean, Mark McIntyre with Duke sitting behind me back here. I mean, if you want to ask him that question, I don't know the answer, honestly, but you're welcome to ask.
No, thank you, Jason. Any additional commissioners with any questions for Jason in his presentation? Haven't heard none. Mr. Scott, Director Scott, thank you for the presentation. Jason, thank you for a good presentation. And
Absolutely. Look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Director Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got our second informational item. This is the first part of the PFAS overview is informational items. This one's presented by Bridget Shelton from the Division of Water Resources, discussing the groundwater quality standards rulemaking update.
Thank you, Director Scott. Bridget, welcome.
Hello. Good morning. As Director Scott mentioned, I'm Bridget Shelton, the Groundwater Quality Standards Coordinator with the Division of Water Resources. So I'm here today to provide an informational item on the 15A NCAC 02L 0202 Groundwater Quality Standards PFAS rulemaking. Specifically, today I'll go over the Groundwater Quality Standards rule, including how we develop groundwater quality standards, as well as the groundwater quality standards that we will be proposing for 8 PFAS compounds.
Thank you.
So first, a bit of background. So there are 3 types of water quality standards in North Carolina. We have groundwater, drinking water, and surface water. While these water systems may all interact, we have separate water quality standards and programs for each of them. So for drinking water standards, for example, these are levels that are for public water systems for the treatment of drinking water to remove contaminants. So these standards are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Groundwater and surface water standards, however, are designed and developed to protect the resource of those water systems in North Carolina. Surface water standards are regulated by the Federal Clean Water Act, and groundwater standards are a state program.
I've included some background slides here in case there's anyone tuning in that may not be familiar with groundwater in North Carolina, but is interested in this topic today. So groundwater is the water that fills the cracks and other openings in bedrock and sand and is stored in reservoirs underground known as aquifers. Water that is contaminated or flows through contaminated soil can end up in the groundwater and lead to water quality issues. Groundwater is a significant drinking water supply source in North Carolina. It supports about 50% of drinking water use in the state, both through public water supply sites and private drinking water wells. 80% of approximately 2,300 public water systems rely on groundwater as a drinking water source. Often, these are smaller systems. They provide drinking water to rural communities with fewer residents. Again, as a reminder, these public water systems are regulated through the Safe Drinking Water Act. For private drinking water wells, 25% of residents also rely on groundwater sourced private wells. It is important to note that there is no oversight of water quality of private well water by state or federal agencies. It is the responsibility of the homeowner to test and monitor the quality of their private well water. So moving on to the groundwater quality standards. So when we say standard, we mean a level or a maximum allowable concentration which may be tolerated without creating a threat to human health or which would otherwise render the groundwater unsuitable for its intended best usage. And the best usage is defined in the rule as an existing or potential source of drinking water supply for humans. So these groundwater standards protect the groundwaters of the state as a resource for human consumption. These are, they're used and implemented in many different programs, including site cleanups, risk assessments, and health evaluations. As I mentioned before, groundwater standards are not a federal program. They are done at the state level using the rule listed to the left here, 15A NCAC 02L 0202. So while the O2L standards are a state program, they do weave into federal programs such as RCRA and Superfund. So these programs in the state do rely on the groundwater standards. The standards protect the human adult population and they target ingestion and household use. The endpoints we use when establishing these standards will be covered in more detail in a few slides, but they include non-cancer endpoints, cancer endpoints, and taste and odor thresholds. This slide, it gives some information on where the groundwater quality standards can be found. So as I've mentioned, they're in 15A NCAC subchapter O2L. Section 100 has general considerations, including policy and definitions. Section 200 has the classifications and standards for groundwater, and section 0202 is where you can find the groundwater standards listed. There are around 200 groundwater standards. We have standards for substances ranging from legacy pesticides such as DDT to metals such as lead and arsenic. These standards are all developed and calculated using the procedures laid out in the O2L 0202 rule, which I will discuss soon. But first, I wanted to cover some important language that's included in the O2L 0202 rule. So there are two places in 0202 where the practical quantitation limit, or the PQL, is mentioned. So the PQL is a laboratory or an analytical term. The definition is highlighted at the bottom in green here. So it means the lowest concentration of a given material that can be reliably achieved by a particular analytical technique during routine laboratory analysis. It's also known as, or you could call it the reporting limit. So in the rule with the references listed up here, 0202B states that substances which are not naturally occurring and for which no standard is specified shall not be permitted in concentrations at or above the PQL. So if a substance does not have a groundwater standard, it is not allowed in the groundwater in concentrations at or above the PQL value. I just want to note here that we currently do not have groundwater standards for any PFAS substance. The detection of those substances at or above the PQL is considered a violation. Also, 0202C states that when a standard for a substance is less than the PQL, the detection of that substance at or above the PQL constitutes a violation of the standard. So this is when there is an established health-based groundwater standard. If that groundwater standard value is lower than the analytical PQL value, then in this case, the PQL value is used as a compliance level for that substance. So later on, I will show an example of this situation. I do want to note here that PQL values can change regularly. Laboratory analysis capabilities are constantly developing, and PQL values can also vary across different labs based on their technologies. So moving on to how we develop the groundwater quality standards. So the O2L 0202 rule lays out the process to develop these standards. So first, they are established as the least of these values or criteria listed here. So first, we have the systemic or non-cancer threshold concentration. This is a concentration that protects against potential non-cancer effects from exposure to the chemicals such as liver or kidney disease. Next, we have a concentration which corresponds to an incremental lifetime cancer risk of 1 × 10⁻⁶, or 1 in a million. So this is a concentration that protects against potential development of cancer at a 1 in a million risk level. Next, we look at the taste and the odor thresholds. Then we look at maximum contaminant levels, or the federal primary drinking water standards. And last, we look at the national secondary drinking water standards. These are also federal levels. They're non-enforceable levels that protect against organoleptic effects such as taste, odor, skin, or teeth discoloration. So we start to develop a groundwater standard for a substance. We find each of these values if they are available, and then we select the lowest value. I just want to focus on the top 2 criteria right now. So the systemic or non-cancer threshold concentration, and then the concentration that protects against cancer. So these values are developed through calculations shown here. These calculations both consist of both toxicity benchmarks and exposure estimates. So the exposure parameters are shown in red here, and they are defined in the rule. So first, we have the relative source contribution. This is the proportion of exposure from drinking water. It accounts for other exposure routes in the calculation. It is defined in the rule as 10% for inorganics and 20% for organics. The body weight is 70 kilograms for an adult, and the water consumption rate is 2 liters per day, again, for an adult. The risk level for the cancer calculation at the bottom here, again, shown in red because it is defined in the rule as 1 × 10⁻⁶. So focusing for a second on the toxicity benchmarks included in these calculations. So we have the reference dose in the non-cancer calculation and the cancer slope factor in the cancer calculation with their definitions listed here. I wanted to highlight these toxicity values to point out that these are the values that we are looking for when we're using the available scientific publication and references. The rule does define which references we can look at to find those toxicity values. So in order of preference, first, we look at EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS program. Then we look at EPA's Drinking Water Health Advisories. Next, we have other EPA health risk assessment data. And finally, if EPA does not have toxicity information in any of its databases or publications, then other relevant published health risk assessment data and scientifically valid peer-reviewed published toxicological data can be used if available. So the EPA references listed here review and analyze data and produce publications that go through intensive scientific review. We often or prefer to wait for these values and references to be finalized, so not in draft form, to ensure that we are basing our standards on the most updated and agreed upon scientific data. This is a groundwater standards calculation example. I know there's a lot of text on this slide. Just wanted to show an example of a calculation worksheet that we put together for groundwater standards development and proposals. So this is an example of a groundwater standard calculation sheet from a non-PFAS compound. It is for aldrin, which is an insecticide. I won't go over everything on this slide, but I just wanted to focus on the yellow highlighted text. So these yellow highlights are the 6 criteria that I discussed earlier that we look at when we develop a standard. So here we have a non-cancer endpoint calculated value, a cancer endpoint calculated value, and then in this example, there were no other criteria available for this substance. So here, the O2L standard for aldrin is 0.002 micrograms per liter, which is based on the cancer endpoint, which is the lowest available value here, selected to be protective of potential human health effects. As part of the attachments for this item, we did include calculation sheets and word summaries for the 8 PFAS for which we will be proposing groundwater standards. That is attachment B. Those calculation sheets are similar to the example shown on the previous slide, and they include the references used in these calculations. The summary documents will also provide a summary of the studies examined and the health effects seen in those studies. Those documents are where you will find more detailed information on the development and the scientific basis of the proposed PFAS groundwater standards. We've also included the proposed rule text amendment as attachment A. So moving on to PFAS. So per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are a group of manufactured chemicals that are used to make fluoropolymer coatings and products. These chemicals have properties including resistance to heat, oil, stains, and water, and can be found in products such as clothing, furniture, food packaging, and nonstick cooking surfaces. PFAS are widely produced and used, and they are long-lasting chemicals that move throughout the environment and persist in the environment and essentially do not break down. They can build up in people, animals, and the environment over time. So these compounds are chemicals of specific concern in North Carolina. And for this rulemaking, we have evaluated the available scientific data to develop groundwater standards for a subset of PFAS compounds. So here is some background information on recent EPA actions on PFAS, specifically for drinking water. So in March 2023, EPA announced the draft or proposed national primary drinking water regulations for 6 PFAS listed here. In April 2024, they finalized these drinking water regulations, which established legally enforceable levels for drinking water called maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. I've included a table from the EPA website that lists those MCLs and those PFAS compounds. So pointing out here that the national primary drinking water regulations are for drinking water and public water systems regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. I believe Rebecca Sadowski is giving a presentation to the full commission tomorrow to go over these PFAS drinking water regulations in the context of public water supply in North Carolina, including some results from PFAS sampling that is ongoing at public water systems. I included this information on MCLs in this presentation because if you remember, MCLs are one of the criteria that we look at when we're developing a groundwater standard. We also relied on the same scientific basis for a number of the proposed PFAS groundwater standards that these national drinking water regulations used. Here's another background slide on previous presentations and information items on this topic that were given to both the EMC and the committee, highlighting first the first presentation given to the full commission in November 2023. So Dr. Franny Nelson gave a presentation on the toxicological information for the proposed PFAS groundwater standards. This included a detailed summary of the toxicity studies and toxicity values available for each compound. I wanted to mention that here because I will not be providing as many details in this presentation, but that material is available online. Information items are also given to the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee on affected sources and anticipated implementation requirements, the cost and benefits analysis approach, as well as the plan implementation timeline, an overview of the stakeholder meetings that Division of Waste Management held, as well as feedback from those meetings. And Jessica Monti will be following this presentation today with an overview of the regulatory impact analysis. So moving on to the proposed PFAS compounds for groundwater standards development. There are 8 PFAS for which we will be proposing groundwater standards. I've listed the full name here and the acronym. These PFAS are selected for rulemaking because all 8 of these compounds have available literature base that shows they cause health effects and they have available health effects data to support the derivation of the necessary toxicological values for standards development. The literature bases for all 8 compounds have been evaluated by a federal agency. All 8 PFAS have been detected in North Carolina's environmental media, and there is a final EPA test method for measuring these 8 compounds in different environmental media. So here are the proposed groundwater standards for the 8 PFAS. There's a lot of information here. I tried to summarize as best as I could in this table. So I just want to point out the references column here. So you can see that the references that we've used have all been published in the last few years. Most are from EPA publications, 2 are from the CDC's ATSDR publications. So they're all from federal agencies. The plus sign footnote for these references designates the references that were also evaluated and used in EPA's National Primary Drinking Water Regulation. I've included the critical health effects for each compound, as well as the toxicity benchmarks and values available for each compound. The bolded values are the ones that we use for the basis of the proposed O2L standard, which is shown in the right column in units of nanograms per liter. One note, for 2 of these compounds, the proposed standard value is different from what was shown to stakeholders and shown to this committee in one of the information item presentations. Those are for Gen X and PFNA. Those each change from 20 nanograms per liter to 10 nanograms per liter, because when the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation was finalized in April of this year, individual MCLs were published for these compounds, which were lower than the calculated O2L standard value. This again shows why we often prefer to wait for references and publications to be finalized, because it is possible that after public comment, values can change, and we want to ensure that we are recommending our standards be based on the most updated information. So I just wanted to go back to the PQL language that was discussed earlier. So a reminder of that language to the right here. So when a standard for a substance is less than the PQL, the detection of that substance at or above the PQL constitutes a violation of that standard. So looking at this table, you can see that for compounds 3 through 8, the proposed O2L standard is higher than the PQL that's reported by EPA. For compounds 3 through 8, the compliance level then would be the O2L standard, which is higher than the current baseline of the PQL. Just to note, these PQL values were reported by EPA as a limit of quantitation from a national multi-laboratory validation study of the test method 1633. For the top two compounds, however, PFOS and PFOA, this PQL language does apply. So as you can see, the proposed O2L standard for these two compounds is lower than the EPA reported PQL of 4 nanograms per liter. So in this case, the compliance level for PFOA and PFOS would be the PQL due to the O2L rule language on the right listed here. Just want to point out too, this is not a unique circumstance. We have a number of O2L groundwater standards where the calculated health-based value is lower than the PQL. Moving on to the anticipated timeline of this groundwater standards PFAS rulemaking. So as I mentioned, stakeholder meetings were held throughout January 2024. Info items have been presented to the full commission and to this committee, including today's in May 2024. The next step is to come to the committee with an action item in July. If approved, we go to the EMC to request to go to public comment and hearing. And then the end of the public comment period would be in December of 2024, which would put us on track to be back to the EMC in March of 2025. That is all I have today. I'm happy to answer any questions, and my contact information is on this slide as well.
Thank you, Bridget. Great presentation. Any questions from any of the committee members? If so, yes, Vice Chairman Baumgartner.
Yeah, Commissioner Baumgartner, Mr. Chairman, if I can have a series of questions. First off, EPA issued its guidance on PFAS rulemaking, and I'm gonna get it wrong. It's NP or the EPA rule NP.
The National Primary Drinking Water Regulation.
Thank you. Sorry, a lot of acronyms and a lot of data. What's the federal requirements at this point for PFAS implementation as it's associated with groundwater?
The groundwater program in North Carolina is not a federal program, it's a state program. So right now we have that PQL language, which are the requirements for groundwater in North Carolina.
But there's no federal requirement at this point in time to start issuing groundwater standard, correct?
That is correct.
So just looking at some of the slide 19, if you would, please. Look at some of the data. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. So the proposed rule that GWM has promulgated, that's listed on the website, HFPO-DA, that's Gen X, is that correct? In the rule, it says 0.01 would be the new number issued in rule. What you have on the chart for Gen X is 3 different other numbers that, or excuse me, 2 different other numbers in 3 different columns.
Yeah, I apologize. I should have pointed that out. So these are units of nanograms per liter. In the O2L rule, we normally report in micrograms per liter. For PFOS and PFOA, it's just better to report in nanograms per liter. There would be too many zeros. So we wanted to just have all of these in nanograms per liter on this presentation.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, last question. These rules need to be simple so that the public understands how to comply. I'm looking at this chart and I'm seeing for PFBS, just for instance, 2,000 for the proposed rule for O2O, 3 for the EPA PQL, and then 2,000 compliance level. So, and I'm just taking some assumptions. We're assuming and we're saying that if we go with a 2,000 nanogram per liter for O2L, that's a safe drinking water standard. EPA saying, hey, it could be 3. That's safe drinking water.
So the PQL column here is that is an analytical detection value. So that is not based on human health, health effects data for protection of human health. That is just showing what the instruments can measure to. The 2,000 would be the human health calculated groundwater standard that would be protective of any human health effects.
You see how this is confusing though. I mean, we're looking at several columns with several different numbers that range in a lot. So anyway, okay, that's my question, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair Baumgartner. Any additional questions from any of the committee members?
I have many questions, Mr. Chairman, as Commissioner King, but by late seeing this presentation and asking for questions, I know I looked at the agenda. Our committee got a PowerPoint presentation just Friday. And at the end, questions, but there's probably 5 or 6 questions I have on each slide. We don't have all day for that. But I would have certainly loved to have had this information probably 2 weeks ago, Mr. Chairman, so I could have drilled down. I looked at the dashboard on the federal, even though the federal's not, but we use EPA a lot on these committee working times. But the U.S. here for the U.S. on my understanding, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency maintains a comp tax chemicals dashboard on PFAS, a master list that they have over 14,000 entries. And then when you drill down to the Cape Fear, yeah, there was discovered 47. And of the 8, my understanding is that the researchers confirmed that only 3 specific PFAS were present. So I think my thought is, Mr. Chairman, if I could just 1 minute on my thought, to find the technology. Do we need to make a rule on just 8 when there's more being found? And what technology are we using that is to identify this chemical compound moving forward before we actually set a rule and have more information from science and health base so we can get more on what we're finding? That's my comment.
Is that a question?
Not a question.
Yes.
I just
Commissioner
have a
Gibson.
comment related to that. Yeah, there are many PFAS and many that we don't even know about yet. And EPA for now is only regulating 8 of them. These are some of the better known ones. And so my understanding is that the state has to make sure that groundwater is of sufficient quality for its highest possible use, which would be drinking water. And that would mean that the water needs to meet requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And those requirements are only available for these 8. So that's why there's the 8. But any treatment technology that removes these 8 from a waste stream will likely remove not only many other, possibly all other possible PFAS, but other contaminants we might be worried about as well. So there's a lot of additional benefits from controlling these particular contaminants.
Thank you, Commissioner Gibson. Any other comments? I did have one question. I know, North, as you've indicated, that EPA doesn't have federal standards for groundwater, if I quote you correctly. What is our neighboring states doing in this regard? Do we track that? Are we aware of what's happening around us? I
Sure.
mean,
Sorry, you're referring to groundwater standards in general or for PFAS compounds?
yeah.
Yes, many states are in the process or have already established groundwater standard cleanup levels for PFAS. I do not have a list right now. I can certainly get that to you. I know that there are a lot of different councils and scientific bodies that are putting together updated tables constantly. So I can find those tables and send them to you.
I think it might be good for the committee to know, and obviously we'll be voting on this in July to move it forward to the EMC. At least have an awareness of what's happening around us. So we're not alone in this. We appreciate the concern there is here and know it's a very important issue, right? I mean, no one in this room is naive to the fact of the impact of PFAS, but I think it would be good if we can have an awareness of what's happening around us. Yes, Commissioner Lyon.
Thanks for the presentation. I just had one informational question regarding the health standards. You mentioned adults and so forth, but are there federal standards for pregnant women or lactating women as far as water quality?
Yeah, so I can speak specifically to the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation. It's a federal program. So I know that some of the levels that they set for their MCLs were based on lactating women, and that was specifically because some of the effects that they were seeing were developmental effects.
Mm-hmm. But are any of those impactful on these numbers that you're giving us?
The MCLs would be if the MCL value is the lowest of those 6 criteria that I talked about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Director Scott, I think one thing we'd like to learn here is that if there are questions such as we had from Commissioner Keene or others that's not fully resolved or answered, and if there was an action item in this meeting such as in this case, I think she indicated she's going to share additional information on what's going on with the other states. Let's make sure that in our next meeting that we have in July, that we put that back on the agenda so that we can satisfy any questions that you would have, Commissioner King, or others here that were not answered during the context of this meeting, so we can put that to the front of the list so that we make sure that we get everybody the information they need. Yes, Commissioner Baumgartner.
Mr. Chairman, I also propose that those questions be the first couple of slides in that presentation so we can go ahead and address those questions initially and then move forward. And that would be for any of the presentations going forward.
Thank you. Director Scott, is that possible we can get that done?
Yes, I appreciate that feedback, and I think that is a good idea to put it at the front of the presentations for next time. You know, I'll just add a little to Bridget's overview and thank her for that comprehensive overview. You know, there are established test methods that test really 40-plus PFAS compounds. You know, what we're describing here today are North Carolina's groundwater rules, and one of the intent of that piece of administrative code is to preserve North Carolina's groundwater as a drinking water source, one of the main reasons for the groundwater quality standards. So as Bridget walked through that table that Vice Chair Baumgartner, you know, commented on, today we default to the practical quantitative limit. And as you saw in that table, there are now some calculated values that actually can be above that PQL. So what we're striving for here today is, as we transition as a state from not only looking for PFAS, assessing for PFAS, folks are asking questions. What do we need to clean up to that's a safe level? And so that's why it's really important, you know, and appreciate the committee's attention to this matter and furthering it for the state in these rules. So today, the rule requirement basically is that middle column. And we're saying what we're proposing is the column to the left of it. So that's a critical message when it comes to practical quantitative limit and groundwater standards. So appreciate that. And we are taking notes on the questions so we can make sure we get those addressed in the next committee meeting.
So just in summary to what you said, from my understanding of the 8, 6 of the standards that we'll bring forward potentially in rulemaking will actually increase from what they currently are now.
That's right. So today, if somebody were to ask, what do we clean up PFOS to? And we are getting those questions. It'd be a military base would be the best example. Put out aqueous film forming foam. Historically, it's contained PFOS. Item number 1, that compound, what's the level we need to clean up to? Basically, it'd be 4.0. That's what the department has proposed for this committee to consider moving forward. As you work down the list, today we're cleaning up Gen X. There are several sites working on that particular issue. What's the cleanup today? 5.0. We're actually proposing 10 because it's a health-based calculated value that's protective of groundwater as a drinking water source. So I just emphasize that because I think it's a critical component. We have these answers today, but there's actually some, you know, regulatory ability within the administrative code based on these calculations Bridget has presented where that level may not need to be the PQL.
And I think it's fair to say, Director Scott, also that even though we're focusing on the PQL here at 4 and 5 and 10, as you see before us, as that analytical capability gets better, then that standard will continue to decrease. Is that right? Because we're using the PQL, which is based on technology's capability to quantify and replicate, basically, but that decreases the technology.
That's right. That's right. And that's a very good point for the committee's consideration, Mr. Chairman. You know, item 1 and 2 per the current administrative code, as this table shows, would default to the PQL. Is that something this committee wants to discuss further, meaning for PFOA and PFOS as a set level? If that instrumentation is able to detect below 4 in a year or 2 part per trillion, 1.5 part per trillion, that would be the level. That's what this table shows for PFOA and PFOS. So it's a very good point you make and something that I think the committee could consider.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Gibson.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, either way, water utilities and also homeowners that rely on private wells are going to have to pay to get this stuff out of their water. And it's a lot less expensive to prevent it from getting into the water in the first place because you're having to treat a much smaller waste stream. Whereas once it's dumped into people's water supply, you know, you contaminate a very large volume that all has to be treated. So just the physics of it, you know, indicates. So somebody's going to have to clean this stuff up at some point to meet federal regulations.
That's a great point, Commissioner Gibson. And likewise, I understand EPA is going to make a ton of money available in a variety of different categories. I hope DEQ and its staff, Director Scott, can make sure that the public in this state understands the availability of those funds, how those funds can be used, and facilitate the process of having access to those funds in a way that can help the citizens of this state with the money that EPA is making available with these drinking water requirements. Yes, Director Scott.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Thank you for that, Chair Reardon. Our Division of Water Infrastructure and the other programs are, meeting with stakeholders regarding that availability of federal funding to address emerging compounds, PFAS specifically. We also, as DEQ, receive money from the General Assembly to assist private well owners who are finding these compounds in their wells. And so we do have the Bernard Allen program. We've sent out triple-digit letters, meaning in the hundreds, to North Carolina residents that already have some of these compounds in their well water and the ability with state funds to remedy that. Thank you.
Thank you. We're committed to having safe water. Yes, Commissioner King.
Mr. Chairman, again, one of the slides brought up the PQL and trying to find that number and using the traditional testing methods. I would like to know what the department, how they define traditional testing methods, what traditional testing methods mean, in particular with the legacy PFAS pieces. And I guess these are. So when you go forward, then testing that or more than the legacy 8. And where do we go and find those points? I think I would like to know where the manufacturers are. So when they realize these numbers and report their numbers to the EPA, what testing methods are they going to use and what testing methods are they going to report to the EPA? If it becomes a federal piece and they start having say-so, then the manufacturers, what do they report? What numbers do they report?
So Commissioner King, for the benefit of time, and we're on time, can we ask that Jessica identify this as a question that the committee will have an answer from DEQ in the subsequent meeting?
Yep.
Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, determining the chemical structure so we can understand where those PQLs are.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
And just, Bridget, if you feel you need to reach out to Commissioner King for clarity, then
Thank you.
Director Scott, we respect that. Yes, Commissioner Yarborough.
Just a matter of curiosity, because he mentioned manufacturers, there's another piece to this, and things change all the time, manufacturers too. If you put a restriction on these products, then what's the alternative? I've dealt with this with agriculture for my whole career. So is it something you're going to go back? You mentioned Aldrin. I'm old enough to still remember Aldrin and de-Aldrin. But that's a very big picture to me, is what is the manufacturer going to do when you make this change? Well, what's the alternative? Is it going to be, how much more expensive is it going to be? Is it going to be less? Is it going to be as effective? Can they produce what they already did? Those are questions we're going to have answers as well. Maybe that's part of that fiscal note, but in the other side of it, we've got to look at their side too. They have to be able to manufacture it. But my concern is what's their alternative if we take these away?
Yes. Commissioner Yarborough, I think a point well made here. If these companies transition to these other chemicals, or is the department in a position to understand the consequences of overutilization of those and what those compounds might be? I think is a point well taken here. Any additional comments on this, Commissioner? Okay, having heard none, Director Scott, I think there is another presentation on this very same topic.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Reardon. We have a follow-up PFAS item with some additional information on the groundwater quality standards proposed, but specifics on the regulatory impact analysis with Jessica Monte from the Division of Waste Management presenting.
Okay. Thank you, Director Scott. Jessica?
Good morning again. So I just want to talk a little bit about, based on the rule amendment and the standards proposed in the rule amendment that Bridget went over, we're developing the regulatory impact analysis as required by General Statute 150B. regulatory impact analysis is meant to provide a representation of likely or expected impacts resulting from the rule amendment specifically. So it's looking at what does the rule say now versus how would it be different under the rule amendment? What are we changing in the rule language? So it's comparing the proposed rule amendment to the baseline. So the important first step of a fiscal note is to establish the baseline. So in this case, the cost benefit analysis baseline for the PFAS rule amendment is the existing statutes in chapters 138 and 143 of the general statutes, 15A and CAC chapters 02 and 13, which govern a lot of the waste management facilities. The existing language in O2L, O100 and 200, and in 200, the PQL, as Bridget went over, is the existing standard for PFAS compounds. So that is the baseline for this rulemaking for the most part. Section O100 also has the requirements for preventing contamination of groundwater and what facility would need to do if they contaminated groundwater. And the other rules under 13 and 2 that govern waste management facilities, which is facility type where the O2L standards are often implemented. Those other rules contain the requirements for permitting of waste management facilities, which are required to be constructed and operated and maintained to just prevent any impacts to groundwater. So some of the programs that we're looking at as being potential sources of PFAS, and going back to the prior discussion, places where we're looking to try to cut off the source to prevent the contamination in the first place. That's what our focus is on for implementing the addressing of PFAS contamination. We're looking at hazardous waste facilities, solid waste sanitary landfills, inactive hazardous sites, and soil remediation sites under the UST program, which was to help remediate soil that might have been impacted from a spill where they were using firefighting foam that may have contained PFAS. So in the draft fiscal note that OSBM is reviewing right now, we will be including our toxicology information, some of what Bridget has gone over before, but in more detail. That'll be one of the attachments. We'll also have an attachment that is our implementation plan for DWM and timeline to address PFAS contamination. And we're including that for information purposes. So the implementation and that timeline, you want to consider that in a regulatory impact analysis to find out the timing of the costs and benefits to show when they would be applied. But because PFAS is this, newer ball game, the plan will also be included to provide guidance on how DEQ intends to address PFAS for the regulated community. And we have authority right now under existing regulations, the statutes and the rules to move forward with addressing PFAS contamination. And the plan that you'll see as an attachment to address the contamination will be implemented the same way under the existing rule or the proposed rule. So that is, the purpose is to show this is how we're going to implement it, whether it's under the proposed rule or the existing rule, if this proposed rule is not adopted. So this implementation timeline, we've provided this in prior information items at some of the past meetings, but we're looking at by the end of this year to complete an initial screening against the industry priority list and providing notice to the facilities that are identified as potential sources of PFAS to complete an initial monitoring to see if they have PFAS contamination in the groundwater. The following year, identify sites where we've seen the exceedances of groundwater quality standards for the 8 PFAS compounds, whether that's the PQL as it is right now or the proposed standards, if the rule has been made effective by that point. The following year after that, if it's warranted where PFAS exceedances were identified, that's when we might begin requiring steps for assessing any plume or the status of the PFAS and looking at what types of remediation might be warranted or necessary. That's aside from any immediate actions that might need to be taken if there's a concern about the receptors and private wells or drinking water around the facility. Completion of remediation is not something we can predict. It will vary by site and depend on the site-specific factors, the type of remediation. We can't say when it would be completed at any particular site. So in working on the quantitative cost benefit analysis and our approach to try to pull together some costs for the impact analysis, we looked to a third-party consultant, it's Brown and Caldwell, to assist us with the calculation of cost curves specifically for the pump and treat systems for PFAS compounds, if it's warranted, if it's going to be required at a site. It may not be, but if it is, then they are looking at what the cost for that treatment system might be and installing one. So they considered the capital expenditures, what would it be to install or build the treatment system, and then continued annual operation and maintenance costs for putting in any extraction wells that may be necessary if they don't already have some, to put in the pre-treatment system to remove solids or other things in North Carolina groundwater that may impact the treatment system, getting those out before the water goes into the treatment system. And we were having them look at 2 shelf-ready treatment technologies and combinations, the granular activated carbon system and ion exchange system, and then a system which uses both technologies at once. It's hard we have many site-specific variables, multiple options for how they would do the treatment, what flow rate would they use, how many wells would they put in. That would all be site-specific and would need to be worked out and considered at individual sites. That might require an evaluation from a licensed professional, engineers, hydrogeologists. So we would need to know all of that before we could determine any site-specific costs. We'd be looking to the facility and consultants to be working on that. So for the approach for this item, establishing the baseline for establishing or adding groundwater standards, we are using the same baseline that we have used in past fiscal notes for establishing groundwater standards. We're not, this isn't a new baseline that we're establishing. It's the existing regulations, the PQL. That's the baseline that's been used in prior impact analysis for groundwater standards, as recently as I think a few years ago when we added some of the IMAX to the groundwater standard list. So we were looking at, in this case, because it's PFAS, we're trying to kind of go above and beyond what we would normally do by providing as much information and quantitative information as we possibly can, the dollar amounts, because we know that folks are concerned and they want to know exactly what we're talking about here. So we were looking at what are the existing expenses and by that I mean, under the existing rule, if they were to address PFAS, what would their expenses be? So in that case, we'd be saying under the existing rule where the PQL is the requirement, what are the expenses for doing site assessment and ongoing monitoring for PFAS? What are the expenses for the capital expenditures I mentioned to put in some kind of treatment or remediation system if it's needed, if it's warranted? That may not be the case at all sites. What are the expenses for continued monitoring of that treatment system? And comparing those costs or expenses to what they would be under the proposed amendment where we have these numerical standards for these 8 PFAS. So so we're looking at potential savings or more like avoided future costs in a reduced need to have to conduct site assessment monitoring treatment system and possibly a reduced remediation timeframe, which I'll go over a little bit more in a few slides here. So we have the fiscal note with OSBM right now. They're reviewing it. So all of this summary is still draft that's not certified by OSBM. Just wanted to mention that before I go over everything. So right now we're looking at it as when you compare the proposed amendment to the existing requirement of PQL, there's no added cost to the regulated community between those 2 scenarios but there is a potential for future avoided costs based on the fact that some of these proposed standards are less stringent or higher than the existing requirement, which is the PQL. So we're hoping that would provide some regulatory relief. So the proposed standards for those 6, as I mentioned, being less stringent, that's where we're hoping for that regulatory relief or thinking that it's possible or potential. The proposed standards for the PFOA and PFOS, as you've seen, is lower than the PQL, as Bridget mentioned. In that case, the compliance level that would continue to be enforced as the standard is still the PQL of 4, as it was shown on the table. So we look at that as currently being no change from the baseline. It'll still be, it's 4 under the existing rule. It would still be 4 that would be enforced under the amended rule. For PQLs, if the PQLs, as you were discussing for PFOA and PFOS, were to decrease in the future so low that they went below the proposed standards, in that case, you would have the calculated standards be less stringent than the current existing rule standard. And in that case, you'd have the potential for future regulatory relief. So if the PQL goes so low that it's 0.001 instead of, and then the standard is 0.01, then you only have to meet the 0.01. You don't have to keep going down to 0.001 after, if the lab can get down that low. I hope that made sense. So looking at that, mentioning the avoided costs, potential for capital expenses, it could be a potential benefit of future avoided costs to the regulated community as compared to baseline, but it would only be for sites that fall under this specific list of circumstances, which is a little bit long. It would have to be that the facility is the source, remediation is warranted, remediation remedy that they select is groundwater extraction and treatment. 1 or more of the 6 PFAS compounds is above the, detected above the PQL, but below the new proposed standards. So it would have to be in between the two for you to see some kind of avoided costs there. And that you don't have any other PFAS compounds, because for other PFAS compounds that are not included in this rulemaking, it's still the PQL is the standard. So that's what they would have to remediate to for other compounds. And of course, PFOA and PFOS would still be the PQL like it is right now. So potential for avoided costs and when they would apply would depend on those site-specific evaluations I mentioned. We can't predict what that would be. You'd have to have the evaluations completed first. And then another potential avoided cost would be for that annual O&M, because some of those standards are higher than they are right now. That might mean that a facility that did have to do remediation might get to complete that remediation or meet the compliance standard sooner and wouldn't have to keep incurring those ongoing operation maintenance annual costs. But again, site-specific evaluations and effectiveness of the ongoing treatment, you'd have to look at after you were doing the treatment to see how quickly they were bringing down the concentration of PFAS. When it comes to human health impacts that we're looking at in the fiscal note, the proposed standards are health-based. I take into account the lifetime risk to human health. The current PQLs, as we mentioned, are based on lab technology. Neither the current PQLs or the proposed standards surpass the risk management levels established in the rule. So as such, the proposed standards are considered at least as protective of human health as the current PQL values. This is providing a summary of the cost. And again, it's still a draft. It hasn't been certified or approved by OSBM yet, but it's showing that additional costs because of the proposed amendment, there wouldn't be any additional costs. It's also showing that there would not be any additional costs to human health because it's at least as protective, as we mentioned. And the following columns or rows are showing the potential benefits in avoided future costs because of this amendment. And then you'll have, as we had in one of the earlier information items said, we'd show it net present value. So that last line you see is the 10-year net present value. We're not saying it would be done at 10 years, but we didn't see the value in continuing to add another 30 years of just providing the same information, the same numbers. And the discount rate you see in that last row is OSBM required 7%. So it's showing that somewhere between potentially 600,000 and 3.3 million is what the net present value would be for one potential or hypothetical DWM site. So this is not showing the total statewide. This is just showing if one facility didn't have to do assessment monitoring and put in a treatment system, this is how much they could potentially save because those standards are higher in the proposed amendment. Another benefit, which we look at as being one of the, greater benefits of putting these standards in the rule, it would assist everyone with having the regulatory certainty for that regulated community, knowing what is the number, instead of, not being sure in the future if the PQL is going to go down or not. They would have an actual number, and that number would stay that number until another rulemaking might change it. And as I had mentioned, the status on the impact analysis is that it has been submitted to the Office of State Budget Management for review. I think it's in the final stages of the review right now, and hope to have it soon to provide. Any questions?
Will be timely. Thank you, Jessica, for your presentation. I have some questions. I'll keep them to the end. Any commissioners have any questions that's on this committee relative to this presentation?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner King.
I'll keep it brief, I promise.
Please.
First of all, I wish I had you next door to my house so I could spend 3 hours a day with you to get all this information, Jessica, because you did a great job presenting that. That you just did. I just wish I had more time. But I do have one specific question I need to understand, I guess, in cost. The OSBM, when they look at this cost that you just gone over, you said a while ago about setting us all up under 2 different areas. Let's go into governance and compliance and following up with compliance and getting either one started from a state standpoint. And been there long enough to understand, Mr. Chairman, that we have lanes to go through, departments and so forth. So how is PFAS, with its ongoing increase and moving through all this that we're looking at, how is the state going to put a cost on that, and what is that cost? I guess that's a question that would probably I would like to have that answered, of what department would set up, how many people would it take? Mr. Chair, I'm just concerned about the state piece on how they're going to implement the governance, the rule, and keep everyone in compliance and keep the standards through science as we progress through the years. Thank you, Mr. Chair, but I would like to ask that question.
So we are already, working on how we're going to implement addressing PFAS contamination at DWM sites right now under the existing rule with the PQL as standard. When you're talking about what will or will not be in the fiscal note, it'll be just showing here's what it is for the regulated community to address this under the existing rule versus the new rule. I don't think when we talk about the state impacts, we say that it shouldn't be very different under the existing rule versus the proposed rule. We're having to address it, look at it, receive results, review these things the same under both scenarios. So what you'll see in the fiscal note is that it's saying there's no difference between how we're implementing it under the existing rule versus the proposed rule. It'll just be the standard is higher for 6 of the 8 PFAS. It might end up being also a benefit for state government that will get to stop having oversight of a site that gets to stop doing operation and maintenance sooner. It might mean that we don't have to have oversight for a site that doesn't have to do remediation because those standards are lower. I'm not sure how likely that will be, but that's how we talk about it in the fiscal note.
Just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Since we're talking PFAS now, we're talking state, and then we're getting into the federal piece, getting away from 1.4. So now we're going to cross over to surface water as well as groundwater with PFAS. And then the state of North Carolina sets up a plan through the state office. And I would just like to know, I was curious on what that cost is going to be moving forward and how they're going to implement it through what department. Will it continue to be groundwater? Will it be surface water? Will it be waste management? So I guess that's a question for another time, but I'm certainly interested in how the state will orchestrate that moving forward.
Well, I think Commissioner Keene, I heard your question, and we're going to be responsible with our time. So Director Scott, Jessica, I think what he's asking is, what is the compliance and enforcement strategy and the burden on the state to implement this rule if it's passed? And understand the strategy and the process that you plan to do that, whether that would be point source or otherwise. And so I'm thinking, Commissioner King, if this could be as an action item to give an overview to all of us on what the enforcement compliance strategy would be related to this and the burden on the department, how the department plans to meet this obligation, or if it's already. Is that something that we can schedule for the next meeting? Okay. Commissioner Keen, are you satisfied with that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions from any commissioners regarding this presentation? I'll be glad to accept.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
A couple quick questions.
Commissioner Vice Chair.
Jessica, just curious, your table showed an aggregate amount of well over $1 million of savings. 150B talks about an aggregate to reach substantial economic impact. I'm assuming right now you're writing the fiscal analysis with substantial economic impact. Is that correct?
We're writing it to say that there is, if even one facility was allowed to not have to do that, which may or may not happen, that it could be a substantial economic impact. So we're writing the fiscal note to say there's a potential for a substantial economic impact. So we're writing, including all of the information that you would have had to include if it was a fiscal note with a substantial economic impact. So either way, we're including all the information that is required under 150B for a substantial economic impact, where it's possible. If it's not possible, it's not possible, and we'll discuss that. But anywhere possible, we're including it, whether it's necessary or not.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, you did a good job with the presentation. I just want to reiterate what I asked Director Scott in the hall. Director Scott, when you get a permit application from a permittee, you don't get an overview of that permit. You get the permit and all the pieces to go to that permit, correct?
We sometimes get all the pieces, but yes, sometimes we have
You
to
do
follow
not
up.
issue- you
We
do not
don't get
issue
all the
that-
pieces the first time.
Yeah.
I can't say that across the board, and that's a
You
fact.
do not issue approval until you have all the pieces,
That's
correct?
right.
Well, the same goes with this committee. We want all the pieces before we move forward, and that includes the fiscal analysis. So.
Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair Baumgartner. Any additional comments? Any questions? Jessica, you did a great job. I'll just echo what Commissioner Baumgartner said. We asked a few weeks ago when the agenda was presented to have the economic impact for this committee, so you can see not a presentation of it, but the actual document submitted to OMB. We know it's not been approved, but a draft copy to this committee, I think, would be sufficient in giving us an opportunity to understand the economic impact and how you see this. So I think, Director Scott, we've agreed to get that to this committee. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Okay. Director Scott, is there any additional presentations? If not, can you help me with the upcoming items before this committee?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the committee's attention today to the informational items and our one action item. We do have just one upcoming item tomorrow at the full commission. We'll be providing a PFAS update on the US EPA's designation for circular hazardous substances for PFOA and PFOS. And then we've noted for future committee meetings, our continued discussion on PFAS groundwater quality standards.
Thank you very much, Director Scott. I'll go to you now for any director's comments, and Director Rogers, if he's here, any comments that he might have as well. So, Director Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Reardon. I'll be brief. I appreciate all of the colleagues' help and diligent work on putting together the proposed PFAS rules. Understand the request surrounding the fiscal note. It's important work. As I've noted, we're moving as a state from assessing PFAS to people asking us, what do we clean up to? What's the target? And so it's a very important conversation, and we look forward to furthering that with this committee.
Thank you very much. Director Rogers? No additional comment? Okay. Before I close the meeting, any additional comments from any other commission members here before we close this meeting? Haven't heard none. I'll take a motion, if possible, to close this meeting, adjourn this meeting. Can I get a motion?
So made that motion.
Any second to that motion? Have a second. Any discussion? Haven't heard none. I'll take a vote. All in favor of us closing and adjourning this meeting today, please vote aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed, like sign. Having the motion has passed, Ms. Attorney, and so this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Is that all, or is it just geography? Is there any sense that representative monitoring is an issue that might be raised now or in the future?
Yeah, I do not know.
I can add a little bit to that, Mr. Chairman. In the standard setting process that EPA goes through, they consider many of the factors that you mentioned and you're familiar with. But in terms of the state's requirement to do ambient air quality monitoring, it's more of a population threshold that triggers a certain number of monitors in, say, a metropolitan statistical area. And just recently, are we now doing more of an environmental justice analysis of where those monitors have been cited? But traditionally, those factors that you mentioned are not considered. And as you, I think you were here during the ambient monitoring section presentation a couple of meetings ago, how complex citing just one monitor can be for the state when we aren't purchasing land to put that monitor on. We're coming into cooperative agreements with usually another public entity like a school that meets very rigorous citing criteria established by EPA that we have to meet. And that leaves very few spots when you start looking at the map. And so, but we are very proud that, you know, that our existing monitoring network, we have more than half of our sites in or near EJ communities, as an example.
So again, it's not only that diversity, but the kind of urban-rural mix in the sense that the PM 2.5 sources over the past 2 decades, looks like it's changed from the fixed sites to something different. And if those monitoring sites are fixed or they haven't changed, are they really accurately representing that? And some of the speciation data I've seen is, ammonia concentrations in the southeast part of the state, those seem to be more prominent, and the neurotoxicity associated with that is something that people have, thought about as far as, that southeast corridor with a very high Alzheimer's risk and so forth. So again, not that there's an answer, but thanks for the response. And I can understand how challenging that would be to find appropriate sites for these monitoring. It's something to think about.
The other big challenge is everyone wants a monitor. And we don't even have the resources to meet the federal requirements for the minimum monitoring network. For example, PM 2.5, we have just enough to maintain that. So that's another challenge for us. And then back to some of the secondary formation comments, as NOx and SOx have been driven down, the importance of secondarily formed organic aerosols from VOC emissions have come up. So that's another piece we haven't mentioned, and very complex because the source of those VOC emissions in North Carolina is largely vegetation. And so it's a complex mix for sure, and changing over time, where ammonium sulfate and ammonium nitrate have been driven down. Secondary organic aerosols have not changed, but the relative percentage contribution has increased. I can talk all day about particulates.
Nothing to do. Any other commissioners have any questions? Mr. Nelson or for the director? All right, then thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the rest of our agenda here, there are two, you'll see there are 2 action items listed for tomorrow.
Chair?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'd like to make a motion.
Excuse me?
I'd like to make a motion.
Oh, thank you. I had already messed up on this earlier about something else. Thank you very much. Thanks to Mr. Nelson. And now I would like a motion to forward this package to the EMC at the July meeting.
Thank you. I move to have the committee approve the proposed rule amendments to 15A NCAC 02D.0410 and accompanying regulatory impact analysis to proceed to the EMC for approval to proceed to public comment.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
A second.
Commissioner Lyerly seconds. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it, and it passes, and we'll pass this on to the commission. Now I'll move on and say that there are two action items on the agenda for the commission tomorrow. I think it's two, but my computer's still not helping me out. And I think that's it, unless the director has some further remarks he wants to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nothing further other than to say thank you to the staff. It's State Employees Appreciation Week, so I just want to say I appreciate you. Thank you very much for all the great work. And it's also Air Quality Awareness Week nationally, and also so proclaimed by the governor. So happy Air Quality Awareness Week. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And with that, unless another commissioner has something we need to bring up right now, I'm going to declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.
Have a good evening. I'll see you tomorrow.